What have I been reading, and what am I going to read after this? I finished another 6 books from my 1,000 books to read challenge, or read 1,000 books in my lifetime. No, I haven't read 1,000 books yet, and no, I'm not nearly close to finishing that goal. I know some of you out there have read 1,000 books. I'm a bit skeptical when people say they've read 1,000 books. I expect maybe 40 or 50-year-olds to say that, but when a 20-year-old or a 30-year-old says that, kind of sus. Anyways, these are some of the books that I just finished reading. Let's talk about these. The first one is A Modern History of Turkey. A lot of people told me to read this one. It's by this guy named Zürcher. I guess he's technically what they call like a xenophile, people who are like really interested in Asian countries. I think there's another famous Chinese xenophile who wrote the Modern China book. Anyways, this book was really good because it actually starts off at the end of the 18th century. And that's when a lot of the problems with the Ottoman Empire really start to begin. It then transitions into the Second Constitutional Period and the Tanzimat period. Basically, after the 18th century, the Ottoman Empire began to have a lot of political divisions, and you had a lot of businessmen trying to run for politics or have regional dominance. People began to chop up parts of the Ottoman Empire. This book actually dedicates a big chunk of time talking about the conflicts with Russia and the UK. Obviously, the UK tried to split up the Ottoman Empire. Actually, a lot of the Western powers tried to split up the Ottoman Empire. There's a whole map they had drawn out. They decided at the end of the day it was going to be too complicated. You couldn't do that. But also then the conflicts with Russia. There's quite a few of those, and this book goes over that. It also goes a little bit into the modern times, but it's not nearly up to date. Obviously, the book cannot cover both from the beginning of, let's say, like the Tanzimat period all the way to modern times. It is a general overview. However, it is not light on detail. There is a lot of detail in here, which is good. The other thing I would say about this book is it is a narrative of people. It tends to focus a lot more on the people rather than the institutions. And since I'm like a big Turkish history fan, I read a lot of Turkish history and politics books. I have seen other books that tell Turkish history through not only political movements, but political institutions as well. Especially in the grander context of World War I, World War II, so on and so forth. That book doesn't do this. This book focuses on people, and it's kind of interesting. If you're not familiar with Turkish, the language, then you might want to spend some time on Duolingo because all the names in here are Turkish, and if you are unfamiliar with just foreign words, yet alone names, you're not going to remember any of them. But if you're looking for a good Turkish history book, I would strongly recommend this one. The next book that I read is Caesar's The Conquest of Gaul. So basically, Caesar wrote these commentaries on his campaigns. I believe they were meant to be political propaganda. That's what everybody says about them. He wrote these commentaries, they're actually quite well written, and they just talked about his strategies used, the reports on the battlefield, so on and so forth. Obviously, it's political propaganda, and you don't want to take all the numbers word for word. Some of the battles are more accurately told than others. Obviously, if it's all positives, then probably people won't believe it. But yeah, this is Caesar's reflections and commentaries on the Conquest of Gaul. I would say if you want to read Roman history in general, then go ahead and read this. If you want an accurate history book, like if you're not just a big Roman history nerd, and you want an accurate history book, do not read this, okay? Because that's not what it's going to be. It's just going to be Caesar's point of view on many of the conflicts. And as much holds true for Caesar's The Civil War. This is another book I read. Because I read the biography by Adrian Goldsworthy. He has a Caesar biography. He references these books a lot, The Civil War and the Conquest of Gaul. I mean, what is probably correct in these books is the political relationships, right? Like he's not very wrong about Pompey in this book, where he talks about Pompey, and he gives his personal opinions on Pompey. He actually says that, for example, in this book, that Pompey could have destroyed him. There was a time, I forget where this was, but it was somewhere near Greece, where Caesar had launched a winter campaign, and as a result he had a few amount of troops, and he couldn't get access to water, which made getting access to resources harder. And Pompey was like camped out on this coastline, and basically Caesar tried to reinforce a camp that was being overrun, and Pompey saw that and made some kind of aggressive move and routed Caesar and his troops. And he gave this famous quote where he's saying, if I was facing a more aggressive opponent who understood how to take advantage of an opportunity, then his reign would have been over with, because Pompey could have ended it right there, but he didn't take the risk, right? So Caesar even believes that Pompey could have beat him. Yeah, these are, again, if you're really interested in Roman history, you definitely got to read these books, right? But if you just want a general history book that's going to be accurate, do not read these books. Now, the next book I actually did a book review on, the Bertrand Russell, Power, so a new social analysis book. I won't go too much into this one because I have a whole video on it, but the idea here is that Bertrand Russell created like this new framework to analyze the social sciences with. He gave the analogy of like physics has the fundamental concept of energy, well, by the same reasoning, the social sciences need a new fundamental concept like power. He was the Isaac Newton of social sciences, allegedly. I would say the book is actually quite bad if you're looking for an interesting book on the philosophy of power or something like this. There are 2 other books that are extremely good that I actually didn't read, but I know they're good because they're the most highly cited and the most systematic. This book I felt like was a little bit too short. I wish it was like 600 to 500 pages. This was only like 250 pages. And the arguments inside the book I found were weak and not persuasive. If you don't have a specific interest in power, I wouldn't read this book, but it's one of the books that I read, so. Now I have 2 more books here that I'm not actually done reading, so I'm kind of cheating. However, I will finish reading them in the next 2 or 3 days, and I didn't want to wait any longer to make this video. Why We Sleep, what's this guy's name again? Mathew Walker. Sounds like a Star Wars name. Anyways, Mathew Walker. So this is a good book. I remember, I don't know if it was the audio book or if I read this book when I was like much younger, when it first came out. But I remember talking about this book in one of my neuroscience classes. This is actually a really good book if you want to learn about the health reasons behind sleep. If you want to learn about sleep in general, I would say this is still okay, but it's not like as in-depth as it could have been. This is more like a health book. A lot of the things he talks about are like, without sleep, there'll be this negative consequence on your health. Rather than exploring like the general biochemistry of sleep and so on and so forth, that's not what this book is going to do. It's more of a mainstream book, which is no surprise because he's writing for a general audience. If you want to get like good reasons as to why you should be sleeping, then I would read this book. Like here's one example. People who slept 6 hours a day. There was this one study where they tracked people for like 15-20 years. And in the study, people who slept 6 hours a day had like a 500% increased risk for heart disease. People who slept 7 hours or less, I think it was a 250% increased risk for heart disease over like a 15-year period. And then people who slept 8 hours had no relative risk for heart disease, no increase in relative risk for heart disease. So 8 hours of sleep was really good for things like heart disease. The same thing holds true for like Alzheimer's and other age-related diseases. If you don't want an age-related disease, then you should probably be sleeping 8 hours a night. That's basically the key insight in this book, on top of some of the generic stuff that we always hear about, like people who sleep 8 hours have better memory performances and so on and so forth. On this last book, I didn't realize how good this book was going to be. And I'm not done. I have like maybe 50 pages left. It's The Wizard and Prophet, Science and the Future of Our Planet. So it's not just a book that's like going to tell you about climate change. In fact, it doesn't really talk about climate change directly that much, more so indirectly. The idea here is that a wizard is a scientist and a prophet is an environmentalist or an ecologist. And anybody who's familiar with the climate change debates will be loosely familiar with the analogy I'm about to give. Wizards are always scientific people who want to find a solution to some kind of climate-based problem through science and technology, right? They want to come up with a new product or a new way to manipulate the environment. One terrific example was in order to fight global heating, we should put more soot in the air because soot blocks out, I think, 18 or 20% of the sun. And so the problem with climate change is that the CO2 catches the sun that bounces off the earth and stops it from leaving the atmosphere, right? It basically stops it from going up. And so it heats the environment up, which is not good. Soot will actually stop some of the sun from coming in, and so that way you can kind of geoengineer some solutions through science. The prophets, however, the ecologists and the environmentalists would say that man should not be manipulating with this stuff. There is a natural equilibrium, and we should be focused on controlling our own basically influence on the environment rather than manipulating the environment to a way that we see best. Maybe you could see this argued in a way that, like, some people say you're not smart enough to understand how smart evolution is. Well, an ecologist would say that you're not smart enough to manipulate an ecosystem or an environment to reach equilibrium, right? Some people would say these forces are way beyond human tinkering or engineering. That being said, there are a lot of interesting takes in important areas for society inside this book, from both a wizard's and a prophet perspective. For example, he talks about energy consumption. Actually, let me look really quickly. He has these 4 sections. I think it's called fire, earth, and water. Yeah. So earth has to do with food, okay? So yeah, that was one thing he talked about, which was genetic engineering of food versus not over-farming soil, right? The prophets say don't over-farm soil, bring back some of the birds that kind of made the soil rich in nutrients, whereas the wizards say, no, it's genetically modified food to be more resilient. That's one example. Fresh water is another one of these things. So fresh water, there's a lot of debates about what we should do about that. Some people say that we should learn how to make salt water more drinkable without having such a heavy diesel reliant solution. I think desalination relies on diesel engines. Prophets say that we should just maybe maintain less consumption and have better policies, like have stone gardens, take quicker showers, things like this, right? That would be a prophet-based solution, whereas the wizard wants technology. Then you have energy, obviously the wizard and prophet. That's going to be the most relevant wizard and prophet distinction, where a prophet might preach conservation, don't use as much energy, let's get off of fossil fuels. A wizard will say that, well, we just need cleaner ways to burn the fossil fuels, and so on and so forth. And then the last thing has to do with air, which is the last section he talks about, which is just climate change in general. So, point being, this book is really good and really systematic and not super biased. It's not like arguing for climate change. It is arguing what a prophet views climate change as and what a wizard views climate change as, and just generally approaching solutions or problems based off of a wizard's way or a prophet way. Super good book. I highly recommend people read it, even if you're a climate change denier. So now let's talk about what I'm going to read. I've had some of these books, or here's one of them, some of these books on my reading list for a very long time. The first one is Shadowplay by Tim Marshall. Obviously, Tim Marshall, famous guy who wrote Prisoners of Geography, Powers of Geography. I think there's one more. Is it 3 or 4 books? I don't remember. But I saw this one, Shadowplay, and it is his, basically him going over Kosovo and his take on the events that happened. I actually don't know that much about like this region, Serbia, Kosovo, etc. I know a little bit because there was recently an issue, and I talked to somebody who was really interested in the problem about like military mobilization. But other than that, I don't know much about it. We'll see how good of a book it is. Tim Marshall has a good way of communicating issues, and so I'm actually kind of excited to read this. The next book I'm going to read is Currency Wars. Basically, it's, I believe, a book that goes over different governments' central banking plans or like finance plans or just economic warfare plans, basically. A good example of this might be, I mean, I haven't seen this lately, but I'd have to check. Before the whole Ukraine-Russia war thing, you had Europe and America were really competing to have oil traded in euros versus dollars. It's called the petrodollar. And a lot of people always said that like the US was dominating, but actually I believe, I can check, I could be wrong, over time the US was losing some of its petrodollar dominance, right? I believe countries were starting to actually trade oils in euros rather than petrodollars. China had its own currency as well, but it was not nearly near the scale of the US dollar or the euro. But after this conflict, I'm not sure if that's going to be the same trajectory. It might have just gone completely back to the US dollar. I don't know, I'd have to look at that. But that's what this book is going to be about, how these currency wars contribute to inflation, how they detriment your personal wealth, and things you can do to avoid that. The next book is Making of the Modern Self. Funnily enough, I've actually read quotes from this book online, and I've had like a PDF copy because I was using it as a source to write about asceticism. It's modern and ancient asceticism. Now I'm going to actually read the book because I actually do like the idea of like asceticism. I find the idea of like maintaining basic hunger levels, not indulging in too much hedonism, basically kind of maintaining like a neutral mindset really helps you focus on your work. It helps you stay not only feeling clean and healthy, but also in some sense motivated because you're not bogged down by anything that's you perceive as negative. Like if you have too much food in your stomach, this is like a negative thing. You might feel sluggish, and that sluggishness can then contribute to some demotivation if you like maybe you don't want to go and work, you don't want to go and doing something. That kind of idea, right? I like the way that ascetics live, not to the fullest extent. I think you can take it too far, but I think, for example, just incorporating some of their principles, you know, not indulging as much, maybe doing some kind of sensory deprivation every once in a while, meditation, fasting, these kinds of things. That's really good to incorporate. And this book is going to go over some of the philosophies behind different kinds of ascetics, or different kinds of practices they did, and how it contributes to their notion of self. So I'm super excited to read this book. Now, this last book is a biography of Beethoven. It's Beethoven, Anguish and Triumph by Jan Swafford. I don't know if I said that right. This book is big, and it's heavy, actually. This book is probably, like, unironically, 5 pounds. Yeah, I'd probably say 5 pounds. I've done enough bicep curls to judge the weights accurately. This I got in a bookstore based off photography. So there was a lot of photography books in the bookstore, and I guess it was like an artsy bookstore. You know, they have a lot of like artists, and basically I saw this as like, wow, that's a big book. I want to conquer that. And also, I know nothing about Beethoven. From what I like relatively, like the very little amount I do understand about Beethoven, he didn't have that really easy of a life. And so I figured, well, I'm going to read this, but on top of that, it's such a big book that I feel like I had to read it because I wanted to conquer it. It's like 1,000 pages, so that'll be fun to read. I'm also going to review this book, so if you want to know what it's about, yeah, we'll see how it goes. So those are some of the books that I have read, and those are some of the books that I'm going to read. If you have any other books you want me to read, as always, let me know below. Some of you guys recommended some gems, actually. I think it was my last video, some of you recommended books below, and they're in my Amazon cart. Somebody recommended this really great series on Stalin, that he said like people complain that it's like basically too much about Russian history in general, and not enough about Stalin. And so maybe this is an issue of like, the book shouldn't specifically be about Stalin, but the point being is like the book is told, it's Russian history told through Stalin's narrative, right? And it's a 3-volume set. It's very detailed and kind of esoteric in some sense because of how big it is, therefore no one's going to read it, and so that makes it esoteric. Anyways, it's a gem of a find. I'm glad someone recommended it to me. You guys actually know a lot about books, so if you can recommend me some books, that would be great. I will definitely check them out. But with that being said, bye bye.